Irish technical committees on actions on structures and is chairman of the NSAI Eurocode Consultative Committee and past chairman of the Irish Concrete Society. Jim has a wealth of knowledge in all aspects of structural and civil engineering and has undertaken expert witness roles in many legal disputes. Our second speaker, Dr. Ken Murphy, holds a PhD in material science from the University of Limerick, and after 12 years working in the oil and gas and water industries globally, joined the National Standards Authority of Ireland in 2017. He is primarily responsible for managing the second generation Eurocode work programme for NSAI's Eurocodes Consultative Committee, NSAI Technical Committee 15, as well as the work programmes of the concrete, masonry, cranes and wastewater committees within NSAI. Ken and Jim will give us an overview of the current status of the second generation Eurocodes and will outline what we can expect to see in the updated codes. They'll also explain how individuals from across the construction sector can and should get involved in the forthcoming detailed development phase. It's most important that the views of all stakeholders are taken into account in developing what will become the standards for structural design for decades to come. So the plan for today is that Ken and Jim will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes in total, following which we'll have a short Q&A session. I'd ask you please to use the Q&A function to put your questions to our speakers and not the chat function. Today's webinar is being recorded and a recording will be available to view on both the ICE website and the Engineers Ireland website and YouTube channel in a few days' time. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Ken Murphy to kick off the presentations. Ken?
Thanks very much for the introduction, Keith. Very much appreciated. And hello, everybody. It's quite humbling to see so many of you attending this webinar and giving up your lunch break on what mightn't be the most glamorous or high profile of topics. I've heard it said at similar events that due to lockdown, you might have watched all of the back episodes of anything on Netflix and are just looking for something else to watch. But whatever the reason, I really hope that you find this informative. Some of you might recognize the Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy Bridge here in the screen, and you might also be aware that the Eurocodes were used to design it. And hopefully by the end of this event, then you'll get a better idea of what's happening with the Eurocodes and how you can get involved. So continuing with the theme of bridge construction and to provide some context around this event, I thought that this image is quite useful to demonstrate, I suppose, the links between the Eurocodes themselves, but also other construction standards. So firstly, we have the basis of design, which is EN 1990, which is used in conjunction with EN 1991, Eurocode 1, actions on structures, but also geotechnical design, Eurocode 7, and Eurocode 8 on seismic or earthquake design and resistance. Now, these are used to ensure that the structure's reliability and, I suppose, robustness are suitable for a given design life of a structure. And for bridges in Ireland anyway, that is approximately 120 years. Now, there's also the material detailing design Eurocodes, of which 4 have specific bridge parts. That's Eurocode 2 for concrete, Eurocode 3 for steel, Eurocode 4 for composite materials, and Eurocode 5 for timber. We also have Eurocode 6 for masonry structures and Eurocode 9 for aluminium. And then the second generation codes, we will have 2 new Eurocode parts, or Eurocodes in their own right actually, on structural glass and tensile membrane structures as well. We'll talk a bit more about that later on. But with all of these Eurocodes, as I said, they are used together, but also in conjunction with other construction product standards and construction standards in general, such as execution standards like EN 1090 Part 1 and 2 for steel welding, which you might be aware of. Also for material specifications like EN 206 for concrete, as well as other construction products and harmonized standards. And at this point, I'd like to point out that I suppose the Eurocodes aren't just design standards in their own right. They do support the European internal market by removing barriers to trade, particularly in the area of engineering services. And they support the Construction Products Regulation and the Public Procurement Directive as well. So to understand how all this came about, we should really look at the history of the Eurocodes. And they were first envisaged by the Commission back in 1975 to support the Treaty of Rome. Then in 1984, the Commission themselves actually issued a set of Eurocodes. Then with the Construction Products Directive, which came into force in 1989, responsibility for the Eurocodes was handed over to CEN, the European Standardization Organization. And over the next 20 years or so, they were developed further. And in 2010, we adopted them fully here in Ireland ourselves. So moving on then to more present day, and then about 5-6 years ago, work started on the development of what's known as the second generation Eurocodes, and I suppose the purpose of this event. And now, at present day again, this year, we are looking at the launch of very technically stable drafts and documents which are being issued for public comment and consultation across Europe. And again, I'll talk about a bit more about that later on. But finally, just to state that while the date in Ireland for the adoption of the second generation Eurocodes still hasn't been formally determined, it does have to be done very soon. And the decision will be made in conjunction with all relevant stakeholders, and this would include government agencies and departments and construction sector representatives. What I'd like to give you now is an idea of what's involved at a national level when it comes to publishing the Eurocode part or standard. The layout of the Eurocodes is the same across all 34 member states within CEN. And the grey pages at the front, A and B, are developed at national level in each country. Now, these are just the title page, but the national forward gives some basic information about the Eurocodes in the respective country. The blue pages are the core Eurocode normative text, and they include the title page, the core text, and supporting annexes with that text. Now, these are the text in these blue pages are the same irrespective of which country they're published in. The text is written in a common technical language, and what that means is that it can be translated verbatim into English, French, and German as the 3 core languages. And finally, we have, again, more national documents. We have the national annexes and NCCI documents, which is non-conflicting complementary information. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's also somewhat self-explanatory. These documents are developed in each individual member state as levels of safety in particular required for buildings and engineering structures are controlled at a national level. And if a country doesn't want to adopt a certain recommended value set out in the Eurocodes, this is done through a mechanism known as the Nationally Determined Parameter, or NDP. Now in Ireland, we adopted approximately 2/3 of the recommended values set out in the Eurocodes as our national values when it came to structural design in Ireland. But where we do deviate, then that's addressed in our national annexes. I just want to mention at this point then that national annexes are normative in the country of origin. What I mean by that is that if you're designing a structure to be built in Ireland, you have to use the Irish national annex. You can't use the UK or the German or French national annexes. Now for the NCCI documents, they provide additional guidance on how to apply the normative codes text in the Eurocodes without in fact contradicting them. In Ireland, Eurocode 6 for masonry design and detailing is a very good example where we have a national supporting NCCI document. It's SR 325, and it gives further information on the design and execution of masonry structures, and it's based on our old Irish IS 325 standards. However, just to make the point that in Ireland, we do also refer to British standard public documents or PD documents, and we refer to these as NCCI documents in guidance as well. And an example would be BS PD 668814 for wind actions, wind loading. And this is likely to remain the case irrespective of Brexit. And I thought I'd get away without mentioning Brexit at some point, but I knew it would crop up. But hopefully I found that that's a relatively useful recap of the nature and context of this event today and the Eurocodes in general. But to get to the meat of this presentation, what's happening now? Well, as you might recall, I mentioned that about 5-6 years ago, work started on the development of the second generation Eurocodes. The work was mandated by the Commission through its mandate M515, and it has become one of the largest standardization projects ever funded by the Commission, but also EFTA countries, with funding standing currently at 11.8 million euro. Now, this ambitious project is being overseen by the CEN Technical Committee, CEN TC 250, Structural Eurocodes, and the work is being managed by the BSI, which holds the technical secretariat for CEN TC 250. And in my view, it does represent the UK's commitment to the Eurocodes. Closer to home in Ireland, work is monitored, as Kevin said, by the NSAI's technical committee, TC15. And I'll talk about that committee in a little bit later on. So the main goals of the second generation Eurocodes, and I think Kevin has kind of elaborated this already, but just very briefly, as I said, to enhance the ease of use of the Eurocodes, to improve the clarity for users of them, to incorporate the new design, robustness and performance requirements, but to reduce the number of NTPs, to, I suppose, enhance harmonization of the Eurocodes across Europe, and to develop a number of new Eurocode parts, particularly on the assessment of existing structures, structural glass, membrane structures, and actions on structures due to icing and waves and currents. The project will see 74 Eurocode documents being published. The vast majority of these will be EN norm, Euronorm standards, and a number of technical specifications as well. The vast majority will be EN standards. Of those 74 documents, it's estimated that 55 parts will require Irish national annexes. And now this has yet to be finalized, but it will exclude Eurocode 8 for seismic design for, I would guess, obvious enough reasons. There are 9 brand new Eurocode parts going to be published, and we've already touched off those, some of those anyway. And 3 of the Eurocodes are undergoing major restructure, and in particular is EN 1990, which is going to give more prominence to geotechnical design, but also give additional guidance on other structures other than buildings and bridges. Eurocode 2 for concrete is looking at introducing new performance-based criteria, as known as exposure resistance classes, for durability and depth of cover. And Eurocode 5 for timber is looking at introducing additional guidance on cross-laminated timber, CLT, particularly for use in high-rise buildings made from timber. So Jim is going to go into more detail on the technical changes to expect later. But in their respective, this is a significant body of work that's going to have a big impact at national level, as a full revision of our national annexes and the NCCI documents we have is going to be needed. Now, while the NSCI is responsible for the publication of our national documents like the national annexes, it's a group of practitioners like yourselves that are critical to this revision. And the group, as I said, and as has been mentioned, is involved in the National Technical Committee, TC15. So the purpose of TC15 and the role of its members are to advise the NSAI on the technical content of the Eurocodes, but also in particular on the national annexes, as well as monitoring the developments of the second generation Eurocodes. Committee members do attend regularly at TC250 committee meetings, both in person and at the moment virtually. And they represent Ireland's commitments and interests at those meetings, making sure that we have a voice in the developments and the changes that are being made. So as the second generation Eurocodes are being developed, obviously the changes to the NDPs and the impact on the national annexes is something that is being assessed by members. And as well as that, you're looking at impacts and need for calibration or research studies that might affect or be needed to determine new national values that we might require. Like I said, TC15 members are individuals just like yourself, and I'll just briefly explain the representation of the committee now. As with all NSAI TC committees, balanced stakeholder representation is required to ensure that the technical content of any document we publish reflects the needs of all stakeholders, and that's irrespective of the industry. Now, that's that industry that the committee is set in. Membership of TC15 is made up of professionals, industry professionals like yourselves, trade associations and organizations, academics and researchers, and government departments and agencies. It's chaired by Jim, who you'll hear speak from later, and I am the technical secretary. Now, participation within the committee is voluntary, but the NSAI don't charge for getting involved in standards development, unlike the majority of national standards bodies across Europe who do charge, but still expect you to give your time freely. The committee has 7 subcommittees under it, and they look at a number of the Eurocodes, principally EN 1990 and actions on structures, as well as geotechnical design, Eurocode 7, but also the 4 main materials used in construction in Ireland, principally concrete, steel, timber, and masonry. Finally, we have a horizontal group that look at bridge-specific parts. Now, the NSAI committee and its subcommittees are always in need of new members and from support from other experts within the construction sector. And we do need guidance to address a number of Eurocodes, particularly in the area of structural fire design, but also on the new parts of Eurocodes for the assessment of existing structures and for structural glass. You might also note that at the moment, we don't have or have had limited interest or participation in Eurocode 8 for seismic design, but also in Eurocode 4 for composite materials and Eurocode 9 for aluminium. But it's especially, from my perspective, the structural fire design, the glass, and the assessment of existing structures, where I think new members are very, very welcome. So I mentioned how the NSAI doesn't charge for membership, but there are other benefits of getting involved, which you might like to consider or haven't considered. First and foremost, you would gain an early understanding of what the changes are coming in a bit more detail than just this event. And you will be in a better position to design and price for projects to the new code requirements as a result. You'll be given the opportunity to raise any needs or concerns you might have about current design practices or approaches that might need to be addressed in our national documents. You can also influence the development of those documents, as well as maybe the codes themselves, if there's any state-of-the-art practices that should be considered. Now, irrespective of COVID, it does provide a number of networking opportunities, both nationally and internationally. And finally, work in the area of standards development is a recognized way of demonstrating your continued professional development, as demonstrated by the certificate here on screen. Now, if getting involved directly is something you'd like to do, I'd really love to hear from you, and you can do so by visiting the website on the screen here at the moment. You can find this easily by Googling NSAI Get Involved. Now there, if you register your interest in getting involved in the Eurocodes, I'll follow up with you once I receive your application. But of course, if you don't have the time or feel that you can get involved directly right now, you can still do so and participate by accessing the NSAI's Your Standard Your Say site, where the draft Eurocode standards will be, I suppose, available to access. You can review them, download them, and comment on them from this site. Any comments you submit would be given to our TC15 committee as part of our Ireland submission on these draft documents. Now, you can find this site by Googling NSAI NEP, but just bear in mind that this is only available to those with IP addresses in the Republic of Ireland. Now, the formal, the public consultation drafts that I've mentioned, they're known as formal inquiry drafts, and they are being issued right now and have been for the past year or so, and they're being issued in batches biannually in March and September each year over the next couple of years. Last year we saw the draft of EN 1990, but also the general parts of Eurocode 3 for steel and Eurocode 6 for masonry. This year, Eurocode 2 for concrete is being issued, as well as horizontal parts on bridges and the fire design Eurocode 1 actions on structures part. They're being issued in September. Right now, Eurocode 3 part for design of steel joints is out for public comment, as is all of the parts for Eurocode 9 on aluminium. Now, once we get these technically stable drafts, there is the opportunity to comment on them, but also it allows us the opportunity to start work on our national annexes, which we have done and are doing on the masonry documents at present. And I'm working on a work program to incorporate the work needed on all the other documents as I speak. So, as a way of wrapping up, just finally, for further information on the Eurocodes, particularly in research and papers that demonstrate their use, the European Commission's Joint Research Centre have a very good website and has a significant amount of background information on the Eurocodes. It's going to be redeveloped soon to take account of the second generation Eurocodes, but still worth a visit. You can Google JRC Eurocodes to find that site. On the development of the Eurocodes and for European standards in general, please visit the CEN standards website. Again, Google CEN TC250 and you'll find that site. On standards for the construction sector from an Irish perspective, you can visit the NSAI site. Again, just Google NSAI Eurocodes and that will bring you to that site. Now here you'll see a lot of what we talked about today, probably a lot of detail there, but also you'll see the current work program that the NSAI have in respect to construction standards and what might impact the construction industry. So thank you very much for listening to me today and I appreciate your time. I'm going to hand you over to Jim, and as Kevin said, we'll take questions at the end. But if you have any questions or comments or you want to discuss anything with me offline, please do at the email address there on screen at the moment. And so again, thank you very much. And I'm going to hand you over to Jim now.
Thank you, Ken, for explaining it. And a lot of what Ken has stated is, you know, I could repeat every word of what Ken has stated and so on. So welcome, and I'll talk through from here. So the first generation of Eurocodes are EN 1990 to 1999. And they were published in Ireland as IS documents. In the UK, there would have been BS documents, in Germany, DIN, etc. And the years of publication of those came from 2002 for the first part, which was IS 1990, on to around final parts. And each of the Eurocodes that was present at that stage were generally divided into 8 parts in all. The most were in steel structures, where there were 19 parts, and there were 10 parts in actions and structures, with lesser number of parts in each of the other areas. They were all generally adopted into Irish practice by the building regulations, Part A in 2012, but and for other bodies such as TII or the NRA, as it was in the time, brought them into play at that stage. So these are now the documents which we are using here in Ireland, and most people will be familiar with these first generation Eurocodes. But as you can see, these documents are nearly 20, or the first of these documents are nearly 20 years old. So it's a slow process changing them, and the process is ongoing, and we're now moving on into the second generation. So there are links between the Eurocodes, and Eurocode EN 1990 generation was called Basis of Design. As I explained later, its title is even changing. It was followed by the EN 1991, which was a material independent code speaking on actions and structures, and that was divided into a number of parts, and I'll mention some of them in the future part of this talk. There were 6 material codes dealing with design and detailing: 1992 concrete, 1993 steel, 1994 composites, steel and concrete, 1995 timber, 1996 masonry, and 1999 aluminium, followed by two additional material independent codes, which were 1997 geotechnical design and 1998 seismic design. All parts of the codes are going to be updated with new layouts, new clauses, new content, and each of them that will require a revised national annex in time to be prepared, setting out what the Irish approach to the NDPs, etc. is. Now, I've highlighted in red a couple of new parts, and I'll be mentioning these in a little bit more detail later. In EN 1990 is going to have a second part, 1990 Part 2, which is an assessment of existing structures and is assessing not only buildings but bridges and so on. So it will be a very important document and needs to be looked at. 1991 will have two new parts, 1991 Part 8 and 1991 Part 9. Waves and currents and atmospheric icing. And there'll be a new material code in 19100, which will be dealing with glass. So there's a lot of things happening, a lot of new information coming in, not only as new information, but in existing parts where there's substantial changes happening. Ken mentioned the mandate M515, which set out goals. The three principal goals that it set out for this were enhanced ease of use, new design performance and robustness requirements, and to reduce the number of NDPs. And basically, I think it would be the second of those is probably taken primary function, in that new design performance and robustness is important, going right through all the Eurocodes. And the documents are looked at number of NDPs, but it's not always directly evident that this has happened. Sometimes this happens because information has been passed from one code to another. For example, the basis of geotechnical design has moved from EN 1997 to EN 1990, which means that there's a lot more geotechnical information in 1990, and accordingly there may be more NDPs in that document. There are new annexes provided for the basis of design document, and then there's a number of new parts right through the document. In 1991, there's a new, 1990, there's the part assessment and retrofitting of existing structures. In 1991, the parts on atmospheric icing and waves and currents. There are two new steel parts, Part 113, beams with large web openings, and Part 114, design assisted by finite element analysis. So there's a lot of movement, there's a lot of work all over the codes. And this has been treated on a European basis, but has also been treated on an Irish basis and assessed by our current committee and subcommittees. So the second generation of Eurocodes is very much as before, but there are a few new documents as outlined down in the bottom of that in red. There's a new PR at the moment, Eurocode 11, structural glass, which is in 3 parts. And there are technical standards prepared, one on fiber polymer composite structures, one on membrane structures. And then there are the other changes within the documents. But as I say, every document will be substantially changed from what has been there before. The documents are all new documents. They're not, and will need to be treated completely so. So EN 91, the title of this, as I said earlier, has changed. It had been the basis of design, but it has now become the base. Operated an awful lot of geotechnical information across from EN 1997. So this is an important this is important for us all. It has made quite a change to this document, which has become more complex and needs to be considered very carefully from the point of view of every country, include Ireland. There will be annexes for different types of structures. In the current version, there was an annex for buildings and there was some information for bridges, but this is going to be added with further information in 4 more annexes: towers and masts, silos and tanks, cranes, and waves and currents. And these will be the basis of design for those, and will have a lot of technical information in relation to how load factors are combined and other issues that will come into that area. There will be 2 new annexes. One will be a basis of design for bearings, and the second one will be vibrations and footbridges. And finally, there will be another part, which was EN 1990 Part 2, which will be assessment and retrofitting of existing structures. So again, you can see there that the development of EN 90 has a very substantial amount of information, and some of it will be quite technical for people designing structures such as coastal structures under the waves and currents bit, and some of it will be fairly general for those of us designing buildings and so on. So this is a typical table within it. I don't need you to look at it, but what this has done, it has incorporated a number of design factors. So it treats the type of loading, which is a permanent action, a pre-stressed action, or a variable action. It gives a symbol for the type of loading. It looks as to whether it's an unfavorable or a destabilizing load or a stabilizing load. Then there are the partial factors for a number of design cases, and those design cases in this table, this is an ultimate design case, are structural resistance, static equilibrium and uplift, and then geotechnical design with 2 design cases. So there's a lot of technical information in here, and there will be different load factors, partial factors to be incorporated for different types of load. You can see there a 1.35 for structural resistance for permanent actions, while 1.2 if it's a water permanent action, 1.5 for variable action, with 1.35 for water, and this will go across. So there's a lot of technical information available there, which will need to be looked at for each code and each annex in due course. There'll be similar tables in the other annexes, which may be slightly different. One area where the Eurocode is spending quite a lot of effort in bringing in the robustness rules. A technical report has been prepared providing the basis of modification of the existing rules. Some of them are in EN 1990, the basis of design or structural and geotechnical design now, and some in EN 1991, particularly Part 1, Part 7, accidental actions. But new and modified clauses have been prepared for insertion into the material Eurocodes, and Professor Alan O'Connor of Trinity is the convener of this group, and he's been involved very much in the development of these clauses. There are horizontal groups Europe-wide for fire and for bridges. Ken did mention an Irish horizontal group for bridges, but the structure of the codes is such that the main part is generally, the general part is Part 1.1, the fire part is Part 1.2, and the bridge part is Part 2 of each code. And then if there is actions across them, these will be carried across and dealt with within these horizontal groups. There's a potential EN 1990 Part 2, the assessment and retrofitting of existing structures. And a current version of this has been published, which is SR by NSAI, which is SR, SEN document reference technical specification 17440/2020. And the scope of that is additional or amended provisions to EN 1990, how to assess existing structures, the modification of retained part of existing structures, the assessment of structure, whether it's based on calculations or based on past performance of the structure. So there's a lot of information in that, and that is a document which will have to be looked at in detail from an Irish point of view, both in respect of changes to bridges and changes to buildings, and indeed all other structures. So within that, this is a table from that, just for an example. It talks about the intervention into an existing structure, and the intervention can either be a construction element or it can be an operational element. Construction can be maintenance, rehabilitation, or demolition. Operation is maintenance, monitoring, change of use. So there's a lot of issues which would have to be looked at, and this comes in and gives an importance to the role of us as structural engineers in the development and of buildings and of our existing building and structural stock going forward. The second generation Eurocodes, EN 1991, the various parts that are in that at the moment. There are 10 parts at the moment. There are going to be 12 parts. The existing parts are being modified to some extent. There's no huge variation or extension to the scope, though, as I said earlier, accidental actions and robustness is one that will have a fair amount of development in it in due course. There are changes in these that have to be brought into account, and a new national annexes will be required for each of these parts. The two new parts are actions from waves and currents on coastal structures and atmospheric icing on structures. There's a detailed part, as bridge engineers will be familiar with, which deals with bridges, and these are subdivided into road bridges, rail bridges, and footbridges, and sections on cranes and machineries and silos and tanks. This new generation, the part 1, part 8 on waves and currents, is a very detailed document, about 228 pages, and it deals with hydrodynamic conditions. It looks at different types of structures, breakwaters, embankments. They're generally coastal structures and how they're affected. And there's a basis of design has to be developed for that, which will go into EN 1990, and that work is ongoing at the moment, being developed. The other new part is 1991 part 1, part 9, atmospheric icing. It's a smaller document. It looks at the ice loading and structures, and generally this would be, I suppose, in the Irish context, the main reference is things on cables for the ESB and so on. The ESB have produced a map which is available and which will probably be used within our national annex when that comes. But again, it's looking at what is the effect of ice loading itself on a structure. So if ice accretes onto a cable or onto a mast, or what happens to it, and also then the wind action on an ice structure, because the area of the structure may increase from a small diameter cable to a much larger piece of ice with a much more substantial loading. So there are important issues to be dealt with there. Possibly not the most urgent from the point of view of normal Irish designers, but something that has to be looked at. And just very briefly touch on some of the other Eurocodes. I'm not going to go into any detail because it just isn't the time. Design of concrete structures in part 1, part 1. Now, Ken has already mentioned that there will be a new section of durability of concrete. And this will have to be reviewed not only by our committee in the Eurocodes, but it will have to be reviewed in conjunction with the concrete consultative committee who deal with EN 206 part 1. So this is very important, as you know, the exposure classes for buildings, the exposure resistance classes will have to come in. Another topic which has come in here is that it is likely that bridges and liquid retaining structures will be put in this part. There were 2 parts of the Eurocodes dealing with those beforehand, but I think it's felt better that these would be brought in and the clauses would be in there. But there's a lot of other new rules coming in, different reinforcement strengths of concrete, using stainless steel reinforcement, various rules for punching shear, etc., lap lengths. So there's a lot of information that will come in that will need to be looked at in detail with the group looking at those. I'm not going through most of the others, but steel, there's changes with different classes of steel. Timber, as Ken mentioned, they've brought in cross-laminated timber and different types of analysis. Masonry, new rules have been brought in. And then in Eurocode 7, there's been a restructuring of that document, and some of the information has gone into EN 1990, and specific requirements. There's a new part 3, geotechnical structures. There's more information in there, so that again needs more detailed looking at. I've mentioned here glass structures. So there are 3 technical standards. One is the basis of design. One is the design of out-of-plane loaded glass components, and the third is the design of in-plane loaded glass components. These are now developed and published. Work has also taken place in the production of technical standards on fiber polymer composite structures and membrane structures. So the issues which are arising, there's the program of this, there's development of this. As Ken said, this is in hand since last year with the production of various parts, and this will go on for a couple of years. And there's a huge amount of work. I think here in Ireland, we need to determine the priorities that we're looking at. What are the critical issues that we need to look at? So the work of our committee is almost, part of it is a prioritization of parts of the Eurocode, but we do have to look at all the parts. There are climate issues to be looked at. A number of the codes, wind, snow, thermal actions, and atmospheric icing deal with climate issues. We're liaison with Met Éireann and the Department of Environment in relation to that, and a group has been set up looking at those issues, but also looking at other issues, some to do with rainfall, some to do with temperature, and so on. So our group is moving into that area, and we do need, as Ken said, we do need assistance. There's a lot of work to be done, and we need people to do so. So the current structure, Ken has gone through this. We've the National Eurocodes Consultative Committee here in Ireland. We've mirror groups for most parts. Part of our role is the development of national annexes, but there are gaps in our knowledge or our cover. For example, fire and glass, the existing structures, new parts within the code. The Eurocode structure in general, there's an overarching committee, SNTC 250, with technical subcommittees, SC1 I've said to 9, but in fact there's more. Sorry, that's the old. They're generally mirrored by national committees, but those technical committees themselves have working groups and task force. There is some Irish representation on these in geotechnics, in robustness of structures, in concrete issues, but we could also look to place people in committees in due course if it can't be. It's an advantage that people who attend or take part in these meetings can get to know European experts in the various fields. So coming to the end, we need people to get involved. Ken has set out the reason, and if you or you know anyone who has an interest in any area of design of construction, you could almost certainly find a role. Ken has explained to you how to get involved. As I say, it is something we would like to pass on, because the codes that are being prepared now are probably the codes for the next 20 to 30 years, bearing in mind the pace of and change of the first generation of the Eurocodes. So this affects our building for the next 30 years or so. So people are welcome and to join, and we will certainly welcome you. So thank you very much, and that's the end of my presentation at this stage.